The ink on my new will was barely dry when my phone buzzed with a text from my daughter. "Hope you had fun tonight, Dad. Don't embarrass me like that again." I set the phone face down on my kitchen table, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I hadn't touched in 6 years, and stared at the document in front of me, the one that had taken me 45 minutes and one very surprised estate attorney to complete. I didn't drink the bourbon. I just needed it there. Proof that something had shifted in me, something old and accommodating and endlessly patient had finally broken clean. "My name is Daniel Hargrove. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 of those years building a landscaping company from a single rusted pickup truck and a lawn mower held together by duct tape and stubbornness. I have calloused hands, a bad left knee, and until very recently, a will that left everything to my only child." That was before the dinner. The evening had started simply enough. My daughter, Renata, had called 2 weeks prior to invite me to her company's annual awards gala. She worked in commercial real estate, a world of tailored blazers and wine lists I couldn't pronounce. I was proud of her. God help me, I was always proud of her. "It's formal, Dad," she said, in that careful tone she used with me, the one that meant please don't be yourself. "Black tie, do you still have that suit from Uncle Gerald's funeral?" I did. I'd had it dry cleaned. I drove myself to the hotel, a gleaming tower downtown with a valet who looked barely old enough to drive, and found Renata near the entrance, luminous in a silver dress, her dark hair swept up the way her mother used to wear hers. For just a moment, seeing her standing there, I forgot all the distance that had grown between us. She looked like the little girl who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way back from job sites, her boots still caked with the mud she'd helped me plant flower beds in. Then she saw me and her smile flickered, just briefly, the way a candle does before a draft kills it. "You look fine," she said, which was her way of saying I didn't. She introduced me to her colleagues, her boss, Mitchell, a handsome man with the firm handshake of someone who'd practiced it. A woman named Diane who handled accounts worth more than my entire business. A young associate named Preston who laughed too loudly at everything Mitchell said. "This is my father," Renata said, and then, almost instantly as if she needed to contextualize me before I could do damage, "He runs a landscaping business." "Oh, that's wonderful," Diane said, with the smile people use when they mean how quaint. I didn't mind that. I've never minded that. I know what I am. What I minded came later. We were seated at a round table near the front, Renata's reward for closing 3 major commercial contracts that quarter. The food was excellent. The speeches were long. I was doing what I always do in these situations, listening more than talking, watching how the room worked, enjoying the fact that my daughter was being celebrated. Then Mitchell leaned across the table during the appetizer course and asked me how I'd built my business. I told him honestly, started small, reinvested everything, grew the client base through referrals. "The secret," I said, "is that most people don't want cheap, they want reliable. Show up when you say you will, do the work you promised, and they'll pay you fairly and tell their neighbors." Mitchell nodded, genuinely interested. "That's the foundation of any service business, honestly, old school, but it works." I was about to continue about the crew I'd built, about the apprenticeship program I'd started 3 years ago for kids aging out of foster care when Renata laughed. Not a real laugh. A social one, the kind meant to redirect a room. "Dad's always got a business lecture ready," she said, with a smile aimed at the table rather than me. "You should hear his thoughts on mulch selection sometime." Another laugh. Preston joined in, very passionate mulch opinions. The table chuckled. The moment moved on. I went quiet, not out of embarrassment. I've been teased about my work my whole life, and I've made my peace with that. I went quiet because of the look on Renata's face in the half-second before she spoke. The look that said she'd been waiting for a moment to do that, to sand me down into something smaller, something safe and decorative before I could take up too much space in her world. I knew that look. I'd been seeing it for 3 years, since she'd moved into her condo, since she'd started dating a man who wore cufflinks to brunch, since she'd begun calling my house in Millfield the property, when she mentioned it to friends, as if it were an embarrassing inheritance rather than the home her mother and I built together. I smiled. I finished my dinner. I applauded when Renata received her award. I hugged her goodbye at the end of the night and told her she'd done beautifully, because she had. Then I got in my truck, drove 40 minutes home, and called my attorney, James Whitfield, who had been my friend since we coached Little League together in 1998. He answered on the third ring, groggy. James, I said, I'm sorry for the hour, I need to change my will. A pause. Daniel, are you all right? I'm fine, I said, and I meant it. I'm actually fine for the first time in a while. Can we meet tonight? He came over. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd sat with Renata doing homework, where her mother and I had eaten 1,000 dinners, where I'd signed the papers to buy my second truck, then my third. James spread the documents out and I told him what I wanted. He listened without interrupting. That was why I'd always trusted him. You're sure, he said when I finished, not a question exactly. I am. You know she'll be surprised. I know. He wrote it up, I signed it. He left at midnight and I sat in the kitchen alone and thought about what I'd done and felt not guilt, not anger, but something like clarity. The kind that comes when you stop pretending something is fine long after it stopped being fine. Let me be clear about something. I didn't change my will out of revenge. Revenge implies you want the other person to suffer. I didn't want Renata to suffer. I wanted her to understand something that I should have made her understand years ago, something I'd failed to teach her, not through malice but through love that had become enabling. She didn't know what I had, that was my fault. Renata knew I owned a landscaping company. She did not know the company had 32 employees, 4 commercial contracts with the city, and had turned a profit every year for the last 2 decades, including the year her mother died, and I kept every crew member on payroll even when I could barely afford to. She did not know that the property in Millfield, the house she was mildly embarrassed by, sat on 11 acres I'd bought piece by piece over 20 years, land that a developer had offered me $2.1 million for the previous spring, and which I'd turned down because I intended to build a retreat center on it for veterans. She did not know about the investment accounts. She did not know that I still drove a truck and wore a funeral suit to black tie galas, not because I couldn't afford otherwise, but because I didn't see the point in performing wealth for people who were performing it right back at me. She'd been embarrassed by a mulch joke. She didn't know she was embarrassed by a man worth more than everyone at that table combined. That was not her fault exactly. I'd never felt the need to explain myself. Her mother and I raised her to understand that work was dignified regardless of what form it took, and for a long time she believed that. But somewhere in the climb, somewhere between her first promotion and her second boyfriend and her third reinvention, she'd absorbed a different lesson. That dignity was relative, that some work was more worth having done. I'd watched it happen slowly and said nothing because she was my daughter and I loved her, and I kept telling myself it was just a phase, just the pressure of her world. The mulch joke ended that patience. Not because it hurt me, because it hurt the memory of every person I'd ever employed who'd worked that land with their hands and deserved better than to be someone's punchline. I didn't tell Renata about the will. I went on with my life. The crew and I finished a major municipal project, a park renovation on the east side that had been 2 years in the making. I broke ground on the first building of the veterans' retreat. I had James and his wife over for dinner, and my neighbor Carol, who'd been bringing me casseroles since my wife passed, and we ate on the porch as the fireflies came out and nobody talked about anything important, and it was one of the best evenings I'd had in years. Renata called on Sundays as she always had. We talked about her work, her apartment, a trip she was planning to Portugal. I asked questions. She answered them. We didn't talk about the dinner. I don't think she thought there was anything to talk about. 4 months after the gala, she came home for my birthday. She brought the cufflink boyfriend, Derek, who was actually a decent enough man once you got past the performance of him. They stayed in the guest room. I made ribs on the smoker. Derek had 2 helpings and seemed genuinely surprised that food could taste like that, which made me like him a little. Over dinner, Renata mentioned offhandedly that she'd been thinking about the property. Derek's firm has a contact who does rural land assessment, she said, refilling her wine, just to have a number for future planning. Future planning, I repeated. You know, for when the time comes. She said it lightly, the way people say things they've been rehearsing. It makes sense to have a sense of the asset. Derek studied his ribs. I had the land assessed last spring, I said. She looked up. Oh. Developer offered me just over $2 million. A silence, the kind that has weight. I turned it down, I said. I'm building something on it. Building? What do you mean building? You didn't tell me you were. A retreat center for veterans. There's a nonprofit board, a director of programming. We break ground on the second building in March. I said it the same way I'd say anything else. Pass the sauce. James helped me set up the charitable trust. It'll be fully operational within 2 years and the land will be the trust's asset in perpetuity. Renata stared at me. The house stays with the estate, I said, but the acreage is already transferred, has been since January. January, she set down her wine glass. That's Dad, why didn't you tell me? I'm telling you now. But though I thought, she stopped, started again. What does your will say if something happened to you? I looked at her across the table. My daughter, who was brilliant and driven and somewhere along the way had started to see me as a pleasant liability, a man who needed to be managed in polite company. The business goes to Marcus, I said. Marcus was my operations manager, 34 years old, who'd started as a summer laborer at 17 and knew every inch of the work better than anyone alive. He's been buying in for 3 years. It'll be fully his within 18 months regardless. End of the financial accounts. Divided, I said. A portion to you, a portion to the Foster Apprenticeship Program, which is also now incorporated as a nonprofit. A portion to your cousin Delia, who is raising 3 kids on a teacher's salary and has never once made me feel small for the way I make my living. The last part came out quieter than I intended, but I didn't take it back. Renata's eyes filled. Not with the tears of someone who has lost something, but with the tears of someone who has just understood something, and the understanding is terrible because it's fair. The mulch thing, she said. It's not just the mulch thing. I know, her voice was very small, I know it's not. Derek excused himself, he was a decent man. Renata and I sat on the porch after dinner the way her mother and I used to, watching the dark come down over the fields. She didn't make excuses. I'll give her that. She was her mother's daughter enough to sit in the discomfort without trying to talk her way out of it. I've been ashamed of you, she said finally, and I didn't even know I was doing it. I thought I was just managing situations, being practical. I know. That's worse somehow, that I didn't even notice. Yes, I agreed, it is. Are you done with me? Her voice cracked on the last word, and under all the tailored polish she was 8 years old again, asking me if I was angry with her because she'd broken the window with a baseball. I reached over and put my hand on hers. I'm not done with you, I said. I've never been done with you, but I stopped pretending things were fine and I'm not going to start again. What does that mean? It means I love you and I'm proud of you and you're going to inherit a meaningful sum of money and a house full of things that mattered to your mother, and that's what you're owed as my daughter who I love. I looked at her. But you're not going to inherit the whole of my life's work and the legacy of every person who built it with me because that belongs to the work itself. I should have said that years ago. I thought providing everything was the same as teaching you its value. I was wrong. She cried, not the controlled kind. I let her. That was 2 years ago. Renata and I have dinner every month now, real dinners, not performance ones. She came to the Veterans Retreat groundbreaking in March and stood in the mud in her good boots without mentioning the mud once. She asked Marcus questions about the business that were smart and specific, and he answered them with the respect one professional gives another. She's not fixed, people don't fix exactly, they revise, but she's revising. Derek proposed last fall, she said yes. They came to tell me in person, which meant something. I still drive the truck, still wear the funeral suit when the occasion demands it, still have a very specific and deeply held philosophy about mulch, cedar over pine always, the smell alone is worth it. My will is still written the way I wrote it that night, not because I want to punish Renata, but because it says something true now. It says that a life is not just accumulated money waiting to be redistributed. It says that work done with dignity is an inheritance all its own, and that it belongs in the end to the people who showed up for it. The night of the gala, my daughter texted me, "Don't embarrass me like that again." She didn't know it then, but she was talking to a man who had spent 31 years embarrassing himself into everything she would one day be proud of. She knows now. That, I think, is enough.